predation, facilitation, and those can be subject to experimental manipulation. But one of the problems of this, Pablo already mentioned, is that species are not found only in pairs in natural ecosystems. Experiments usually focus on a small subset. For instance, a colleague of mine reviewed 311 experiments that have been published since the early 60s in the literature, particularly in marine habitats, to examine how they are dealing or coping with the complexity of natural systems. And among the many patterns that they found, which are not very encouraging in terms of which are the level of complexity that is included in these experimental manipulations, just want to mention this, the number of species. And although the number of species that are being manipulated by ecologists experimentally has increased over the past 40, 60 years, still the great majority of experiments consider less than 10 species in their manipulations. What is the limitation of this? Like Pablo mentioned in the previous talks, is that most natural communities in all Earth ecosystems are composed by hundreds and up to thousands or tens of thousands of species in the case of microorganisms. So by relying solely on experimental manipulations, we are very, very far from providing a more realistic picture of what might happen in this natural ecosystem by our actions in the planet. But besides the problem of not having enough time to perform those millions of experimental manipulations needed in spacious, rich systems, there is a problem of uncertainty that Pablo referred to at the end of his talk. Even if we could manage to understand well the interaction between two components of a real ecosystem, the interaction between these two sets of species there, the propagation of those effects over the food web, it makes the problem basically hugely uncertain in terms of predicting what would actually happen in the long term after a given species become extinct. So we need to find ways to embrace this complexity of multiple species that interact in many different ways in natural ecosystems. Food webs, which is the depiction that I just showed you, where it's shown who eats who in a given community, are in many ways like the backbone of ecological networks. It shows us the transfer of matter and energy from one species, which is usually represented as a node in that web, to another species, and they are connected to those that we call trophic type of interactions. But food webs are only the portray of that type of interaction, consumption. And we know that species interact in different ways, not only by consuming each other, which is not very nice, but also through, for instance, competing for resources like interference competition, which is very common in sessile species, both in marine and terrestrial habitats. Plants normally usually compete for space or for nutrients and water resources. But also there is positive interactions among species like habitat facilitation, and this occurs in all ecosystems in the planet, like facilitation of associational defenses, pollination, the provision of habitat as refuge to predation or as refuge to environmental stressful conditions. So an ecological network is basically composed of at least two different types of species interaction. The one that we call trophic and conform the food webs, which are being much more studied in ecology, and another type of interactions that we in general call non-trophic interactions, just like Pablo mentioned before. And in an ecological real network, the species interact in different ways, and these two networks are composed basically in one set of interactions with multiple levels. A little while ago, we proposed an approach to integrate both consumption and non-consumption types of interactions, and non-trophic interactions are of two types, so that you understand. They can be the type where a given species that is reflected here as a node alters the rate of biomass transfer, meaning alters the consumption of one species that we usually call a predator of the prey. And we call that non-trophic interactions that directly affect feeding. But there is also non-trophic interactions that modify the attributes of another species in terms of biomass assimilation or overall performance, and eventually the fitness of that given interaction. So when you visualize non-trophic interactions as these two different broad types of effects, it is possible to actually integrate very, very diverse non-trophic interactions together with consumption types of interactions in a given web. And we proposed in that publication years ago a modeling approach based on biomass transfer functions of Yotsis and Ines, which we later, this was a sort of a deterministic system, but open to immigration and emigration of biomass, because we were already thinking of open marine systems. And Rolando Rebolledo, Pablo, and several co-authors proposed a stochastic version of this system in which species interact in a given local community through consumption and non-trophic interactions, but they also interact with unobserved components of the systems, which is this kind of Brownian noise here in the system, and by the immigration and emigration of biomass with other parts of that ecosystem. So I invite you to visit that paper. So how can we construct empirical ecological networks that allow us to start understanding propagation of effects in these complex systems? First, the trophic component of these networks are relatively easy to obtain, and easy is like, well, easy for us, except for the people that are actually doing gut content analysis and analyzing diets of hundreds or thousands of species. But they basically are relatively easy because they are binary. A species either consume or does not consume a given prey. So they can be potentially constructed, and that is being one of the reasons why we have several well-resolved food webs in nature, and they're available for study. Non-trophic interactions, on the other hand, are much harder to obtain because in general they are none of the binary type, and instead they are a function of the biomass or abundance of a given species. The best example is that one tree does not make a forest. So the effect of a forest on the community under that forest depends on actually having many trees. One tree will not become a forest community. So that creates problems in terms of how do we integrate those non-trophic type of interactions in food webs. The other way to construct this network, which is the most commonly used, is trying to reconstruct it from patterns of co-occurrence or patterns of relative abundances of species over space or time, but mostly over space. And that is particularly used in communities of microorganisms because those type of data can be collected through molecular techniques. And in general, co-occurrence patterns are much more easily available in most ecosystems. This is the type of problem that we've been analyzing and that Pablo focused on in the previous talk, whether knowing patterns of co-occurrence, could we reconstruct a network that we have defined from direct observations? What am I going to be talking to you, showing you briefly, are the networks that we construct from this process, knowing trophic interactions and the known non-trophic type of interactions that govern a given community. And the system that we focus on is the rocky shore of central Chile. The reason being that it's not tremendously rich in species. There are about between 110 and 140, 150 species that co-occur in these rocky shores, and that it has a very rich history of experimental manipulations that allow us to infer at least we think most of the most relevant non-trophic type of interactions among these species. So I'm going to jump directly to show you how we can or how those ecological networks look like. And first, this is the food web of the rocky shore of central Chile, meaning all these links are trophic interactions between sets of the species that consume other species or prey. Okay, and in this case, we have 104 species that co-occur in the rocky shore. Um, Many of these species, I just mentioned this because it's one of the aspects that we are very interested on, understanding which is the impact of fisheries. Artisanal or coastal fisheries in Chile are tremendously important economically and socially, and they are multi-species, meaning that they simultaneously collect a large number of species at all trophic levels, from primary producers to intermediate consumers to top consumers. And that, of course, is bound to have impact throughout this ecological network. Now I present to you the non-trophic feeding interactions. These are the positive interactions. We have only 155 positive non-trophic interactions depicted in here. And these are the non-trophic negative interactions, meaning basically interference competition among species for territories in the case of mobile species, or directly for space to settle and grow in the case of sessile organisms. You can see that the non-trophic negative interactions are by far more common than the positive effects in these communities. This does not mean that those links are more or less important. This is only the presence of these interactions in the ecological network. Um, what allows this type of construction, what allows us to do is, for instance, to examine not only which is the most important predator in terms of the number of prey that it consumes or the centrality in the network or other network statistics, but it also allows us to examine what ecologists usually call bioengineering species, or species that are critical in the network because of provisioning of habitat, not only because of consumption effects. For instance, these two different mussel species are very important in this community in terms of their positive and non-trophic interactions or effects on many other species in that community. We have also examined a little bit in knowing or getting this glimpse into a real ecological system. We've been examining whether there is a given structure of these complex sets of interactions. By the way, these are called multiplex networks because the links have qualitatively different meanings. So multiplex in this case has the trophic, the non-trophic positive, and the non-trophic negative type of interactions, which is, we do the analogy, the closest thing probably to Darwin's entangled bank. So is there a structure on this entangled bank of the intertidal zone? And in general, we've seen that there are patterns that the total number of ways in which species interact in these three multivariate axis of interactions is relatively limited. And in fact, that we can fold this community of 104 species into 14 nodes that we call multiplex clusters in terms of the way in which a given species interacts trophically, non-trophically with other species in that community. And we've done a little bit of modeling showing that that particular empirical structure of the community with the trophic, non-trophic, positive and negative links apparently provides some level of resilience to the intertidal ecological network. Much more needs to be done in that regard. So these are just a representation of those 14 nodes and the relative importance or influence of the different types of interactions and motifs in that community. We have also started to examine how these networks vary over space so that we can start examining the effects of environmental conditions. There is very little done comparing how liable, how sensible are the different types of interactions in a community. We have lots of information about individual species, but very little still about whether, for instance, general network attributes vary more or less with variability in sea surface temperature, or in general could be air temperature, or productivity of the environment. And since we have this system, and Pablo showed it for the other talk, of multiple sites along the central coast of Chile that are subject to very variable environmental conditions in terms of temperature and primary productivity, we are examining which of these types of interactions vary most and in which way. And I'm not going to show you details, but basically the least sensitive type of interactions that we've seen in this community are actually the trophic type of interaction, those consumptions between species, and the most sensitive are the non-trophic positive interactions. So the ones that correlate and or change most among the entire community with changes in environmental conditions are those positive type of interactions. The main factors or that we potentially consider driving factors of those changes are indicators of productivity in the system and environmental predictability. So even more than mean average conditions, those indicators of how much the environment is varying from place to place has more effect on the structure of the network and particularly of the positive type of interactions. So that's the part that I wanted to tell you about the network analysis that in many ways it should have been probably a little bit before what Pablo shows, because this is the basic system that is inspiring some of our research where we try to relate empirical observations with modeling of those processes. So I don't know, Paul, how we're doing with time.
Dear Sergio, in fact, that's you are quite good for the time. You
okay?
Still some time. And by the way, I wanted to notice that I was happy to know about the founder of this word, ecology. That's this Haeckel, as far as I understood.
Yeah, I have Haeckel books around here. Beautiful.
It is extremely beautiful, I should say.
Absolutely.
Yes. So please go ahead if you.
Okay, great. So let me turn up the. Okay, there. So I'm going to switch gears here quite a bit actually, but still remaining pretty salty, meaning that I'm still in the coastal marine communities and in the same part of the world in central Chile. And I'm going to tell you a little bit what we are doing in terms of examining consequences of climate change and long-term trends, particularly in the replenishment of coastal populations. And by replenishment, I mean the ways in which these usually exploited coastal populations are being recovered from that exploitation or can increase in size after impacts or natural or human caused impacts. Just as an introduction, because depending on which part of the world you live in, you might or not be aware that there is large heterogeneity in global ocean warming. While the general trend of ocean warming is, of course, increasing in the planet, there have been very important hiatus over time. So it's not increasing at a constant rate. And one of the reasons apparently is related to uh, wind-driven circulation in the ocean. So the patterns of or intensification of winds can be important and so and extensive enough over the planet that can even be responsible for global reduction in the rate of global warming. That is just to show you the importance of wind-driven circulation in the planet. When we look at a coastal eastern boundary upwelling ecosystem, what are the things? The upwelling ecosystems are those regions of the world depicted here. These are the four main large upwelling ecosystems of the world, which are the western coast of the continents, in which we have predominantly equator winds, and those winds produce the upwelling of cold, nutrient-rich water. So the winds, through water displacement of the surface layer, produces the effect that nutrient-rich, much colder water comes up to the surface near the coast. The phenomenon is tremendously important not only for the ecology of these large marine ecosystems, but also for the overall productivity. These are the four most productive areas of the world, and where most of the fisheries, and by that I mean about 80% of the total landings of fish biomass, comes from these four regions of the world. What has been happening here in this part of the world has been predicted by theoretical models since the early 90s. And we now have enough observations around the world to show that those predictions are coming true in most of these regions, which is that the increased pressure gradients are actually increasing the upwelling winds in all these sections. And by increasing upwelling winds, we are actually increasing the cold waters near the shore. So in many of these regions of the world, particularly California, Chile, and South Africa, there has been a general cooling of the surface ocean. The one exception is the Iberian Peninsula, which apparently has seen overall average warming. One of the phenomena that is driving these changes in all upwelling ecosystem is related to the high pressure systems that dominate wind regimes in those regions of the world. And in the case of the Humboldt upwelling ecosystem in South America, that high pressure system is called the South Pacific Anticyclone, SPAC. And in all these regions of the world, these high pressure systems have intensified, but particularly they are migrating poleward. So they generally move seasonally over time, I mean, through the year. But since about 2 decades ago, that seasonal migration has been moving poleward in the southern and northern hemisphere. And this graph here on the right, on the bottom right, is showing the importance of the position of this high pressure system on the alongshore wind speeds. So there is a very nice correlation between where that system is positioned latitudinally and how intensive are the upwelling favorable winds on the shore. So what we showed recently is that the South Pacific anticyclone is also moving poleward, and that movement occurs mostly in spring, which is this dashed line here. So it's moving from being around 32 in spring, summer months to be now sitting at about 35 degrees of latitude over the past, I think, 5 years. So in the early 90s, the anticyclone was much further north during springtime. And in fact, in spring, summer, it was right in front of Las Cruces, which is where we are sitting here at the marine station of our university, where I am now actually giving this talk. But it's been moving further south over the past 15, 20 years. We also show that besides this large scale effect, we've seen a more localized effect that is called the Bacon effect, which was predicted by Andy Bacon in the 90s, which is that the increased land sea pressure gradient because of the heating of the earth is faster than the heating of the ocean, also produces increased winds that, due to Earth rotation, become upwelling winds. And because of the solar radiation gradient, those effects also have a latitudinal component. And we show that we get this effect of upwelling Bacon effect over the past 20 years, only north of about 30 degrees of latitude, which is also related to the position of the Andes Mountains. You know, the Andes Mountains become a major barrier to winds, and that's why they influence the latitudinal position of the wind rotation over the ocean. We also show in that contribution that I don't know how to, if you see this square on my screen, but I can't move it. Sorry about that if you see it, but we show analyzing chlorophyll over the past 20 years that there have been significant long-term trends in primary productivity of the surface ocean near the coast, but that those trends have been in opposite direction, north and south of about 30 degrees of latitude. And that is related to this migration of the South Pacific anticyclone. So in the northern section, there is a relatively narrow band, narrow still 50 to 100 kilometers offshore, but a relatively narrower band of increased primary productivity significantly over the past 20 years, while south of that latitude, there is being a significant decrease all the way down to about 35 degrees of latitude. And this is related to the fact that the anticyclone that used to be seated in this region during spring, summer, now has moved farther south, decreasing the upwelling of cold nutrient-rich waters in these sections, and apparently reducing the primary productivity of that part of the world. In contrast, in this part, in the northern region, that increased Bacon effect, the increased winds due to the land-ocean pressure differential, is producing a more localized upwelling of nutrients near the shore. What I want to show you is what we've been doing in terms of the effects of those type of changes up the food web, whether changes in primary productivity are propagating up the food web. And I'll remind you, for those of you that took your any biology class many years ago, that most marine organisms reproduce through by having a larval stage, and that larval stage for many of these species, including most exploited species, develops in the ocean for some period of time and then recruit back in the coastal habitat. And many of these species feed, and they need to feed on phytoplankton. So we've been examining some of the species that have larvae that feed in the plankton and whether changes in productivity are affecting them. We have 20 years of monthly recruitment rates and quantification of the arrival of those things to the shore at multiple sites. And we are fortunate enough that our sites encompass that oceanographic transition zone. And this is again produce this transition at about 30 degrees of latitude is produced by the fact that the anticyclone sits in this region most of the year and then migrates in the spring, summer month to the south. This is the way those time series look like for those of you interested a little bit in time series. And these are just the anomalies over time at multiple sites. And just by looking at this, you can see that in most of the sites to the north, this is north and south, the anomalies were negative during the end of the 90s and early 2000s, and they became mostly positive toward the past 10 years. While in the south, it's a little bit less clear, but you see that most of the anomalies were positive early on and they became negative toward the later part of the time series. And just very briefly, these are GAM feeding models, general additive model fittings to the regions, and you see basically positive trends of recruitment in the region of positive trends in chlorophyll in primary productivity. You see a region with no trends, which is probably where you see the switch in wind regimes, and then mostly negative trends in the south. And recruitment rates across the region are positively correlated with the long-term mean chlorophyll concentration measured in front of those sites. What we've seen also, so that primary productivity is propagating up the food web through apparently the larval stages of these organisms, and also that the rates of propagation of the positive and negative effects are different. Positive effects have been faster, of larger magnitude per unit of chlorophyll change in the north than the negative change that we observe in the southern domain of phytoplankton trends, both in terms of recruitment and in terms of the adult abundance. So what regulates the rates of change in replenishment of these populations is related to what we call the stock recruitment or recruitment stock relationship, which is that in which way variability in productivity that affect larval survival and recruitment in terms affect the adult stock, the total reproductive adults that produce larvae for the next year. So if you look at the recruitment, the previous year versus the stock or abundance of adults, you see that the relationship has a much faster slope in the northern region, which is probably associated to that or creates that positive stock recruitment feedback, while in the south, the relationship is much flatter, meaning that the adults are, or the population of adults is decreasing at a lower rate per unit change in recruitment. And we think that that is related to the fact that those adults can live for several years. And in many ways, it's tricky because they are kind of storing those bad years of recruitment, but that has a limit. If these are long-term trends in productivity, that a buffer is going to disappear soon, and these populations then we expect to rapidly collapse. So that's what I wanted to tell you. Two very different areas, but it's still in the same ecosystem and how we're trying to connect empirical observations and our explanations from models. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gracias. Thank you very much to you. And I don't know if there are some questions after those incredible images and very interesting talk. Is there some comments or questions? No? Okay. So what should we do? So in this case, I think that we should maybe make a small pause